In this video, I'm going to discuss the oppression framework and the cycle of socialization presented in Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. The oppression framework was developed by Rita Hardiman and Bailey Jackson. This framework discusses how oppression functions and who is responsible for oppressing whom. The basis of this framework is the concept of social groups. A group is a group of people who share particular characteristics within a category. So, for example, within the category of gender, people who share the characteristic of identifying as female would be women. So here are some more examples. Social identity categories of race, for example, being broken down into particular social groups of particular races, such as multiracial, Latino, Black, white, Asian. Now, social groups are not neutral. The membership in these groups has particular status, a sense of power, and an impression in society of how powerful this group is in relationship to other groups. However, this status is not innate. It's not because of the group itself. This status is socially constructed. We build this as a society. Now, oppression is the system that maintains advantage and disadvantage based on the stereotypes of social group memberships. So it's a system that maintains advantage for members of a male social group, or members of a white social group, or members of a Protestant Christian social group, or a wealthy social group. Now, oppression operates on multiple levels. It can be individual, it can be institutional, and it can be cultural. Individual would be conducted by a person, institutional by an organization or a system, and then cultural would be by cultural practices that aren't necessarily regulated by an institution. Now, oppression can be intentional, meaning it's done on purpose, but it can also be unintentional. Much of oppression happens subconsciously, accidentally. No one means to oppress anybody, it just happens. Oppression can also operate in multiple dynamics. It can be vertical, up, down. It can be horizontal, side to side, or internalized, in which case it happens within a person. Vertical oppression is when an advantaged group oppresses a targeted group. So in this case, if we have heterosexual people who are harassing and bullying gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer people, that would be vertical oppression. The group with power is directing their oppression at the group without power. Horizontal oppression happens within an advantaged group or within a targeted group. So white parents who tell their white daughter that she cannot date a person of color, that is maintaining an oppressive system within the advantaged group. Targeted to targeted, that would be like a group of poor people calling another group of poor people white trash. That would be a case of both people are oppressed, but they are oppressing one another, and they're maintaining the oppression within their own group. Internalized oppression happens within ourselves. So a wealthy person who goes into a poor neighborhood and feels like, I'm too good for this place, I don't want to be here, I'm scared to be here, that's happening within themselves, that they're maintaining that system of oppression. Targeted could be someone with a learning disability telling themselves, I'm too stupid, I can't do this. That would be them taking a stereotype and applying it to themselves. So that covers the framework of oppression. I'm now going to move on to the cycle of socialization, and I'm specifically going to focus on racism with the cycle of socialization. Cycle of Socialization was developed by Leanne Bell, Barbara J. Love, and Rosemary A. Roberts, also published in Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. The main assumption of the cycle of socialization is that we are not born with oppressive attitudes or beliefs. And so, with a focus on race, we are not born with racism. We are not born with any concept of race. Race is entirely a social construction. So, at birth, when we haven't yet been exposed to society, we don't yet know anything about racism. However, we develop racist attitudes, values, and beliefs. We become exposed to them and begin to internalize them through socialization. That means interaction with society, interaction with other people. It is by interacting with people that we begin to acquire racist attitudes, values, or beliefs. Now, this socialization is not always obvious, and it's not always on purpose. It's often very subtle. It is often covert as opposed to overt. Overt means obvious, covert means secretive or hidden. This is what the cycle of socialization looks like as a diagram. So as you can see, we are born with no guilt, no blame, no racism at all at birth. But then over time, we begin to learn racist attitudes and values. Like we'll learn from our family or from our friends or from teachers, people who love us and care about us. And again, this often is not done on purpose. As a child, when driving through a poor neighborhood, a neighborhood that was primarily people of color, my mother would lock the car doors. And she wasn't trying to teach me racist beliefs, but I started to believe that certain people who looked a certain way were bad people, and that's why we had to lock our doors. This initial learning is then reinforced by social institutions and by our culture. We then accept things that's just the way it is. We can't change it. And we end up subconsciously teaching these things to other young people, and the cycle continues. The way to break the cycle, though, is to educate ourselves and develop our awareness, and then take action to try and stop this. So some of the institutions that reinforce racism include media, schools, language that would be more cultural than institutional, the judicial system, the economic system, the political system. For example, thinking about the political system, the vast majority of our elected officials are white. So even if it's completely accidental, perhaps, or not on purpose, we don't require these positions to be held by white people, but the message is conveyed that politicians and people with power look a certain way. They tend to be white, they tend to be male. Our economic system, you notice that most people who are poor are people of color, wealthier people tend to be white. We start to perceive race as having an element of class to it. In terms of language, we tend to unconsciously assign positive values to whiteness, negative values to darkness or blackness. We'll talk about evil. An evil heart is a black heart. We talk about purity and goodness as being white. We say a little white lie. When referring to good, we usually talk about light. When referring to evil, dark. Another thing is we also will often say like nude color or flesh color as referring to the color of white skin for Band-Aids or crayons, or the color of pantyhose. In terms of education, you notice that schools with more resources, wealthier schools, tend to also be whiter schools. There's a sense that we see higher educational achievement levels among white communities rather than communities of color, reinforcing a negative stereotype of the intelligence or the ability of people of color. In terms of media, the vast majority of the actors that we see are white. When people of color are portrayed, it's often in a minor role or a stereotypical role. Not always, but often. In cartoons, good characters, heroes, often have lighter skin than the villains. The villains are often darker. Even in The Lion King, where they are lions, not people, Scar the lion is darker than Simba the hero. In our judicial system, we see that our prisons are filled with people of color. That was the bell. Our prisons are filled with people of color, and Black men are more likely to go to prison than to go to college. So all of these systems, rarely on purpose, reinforce racist attitudes, beliefs, and assumptions. Now, one of the positive things about the cycle of socialization, though, is that socialization can work both ways. Right now, we have a society that tends to socialize people to unconscious racist attitudes and beliefs. However, through education and awareness and action, it is possible to raise our consciousness and to take steps to transform the system of racism that we find ourselves in. The bad news is that we are socialized with racist attitudes and beliefs. But the good news is that we can conduct anti-racist socialization in order to transform systemic oppression in our society.